and there is a looming crisis for Puerto Rico that is deeply interconnected, not only with the daily lives of many people there, but with the broader economy and Wall Street in particular. Here to tell us about that is Daniel Marans. Daniel is a reporter with the Huffington Post. Before that, he was an interview producer for Al Jazeera's daily news discussion program. And in the early dawn of his career, he was even the producer of this program. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here as always, Richard.
Well, listen, it's great. It was great to read your piece, 5 Things You Should Know as Puerto Rico Confronts Its Unpayable Debt. Very well-written piece, very good explainer on this, and things have probably moved even since you wrote this piece. But Puerto Rico is facing a deadline, July 1, for it's already defaulted on one payment, right? And now $2 billion is coming up for payment. It doesn't look like they're going to be able to do anything about that, right?
No, it does not, though there will be a whole lot more political pressure that's going to come to bear over this upcoming deadline on July 1st. It should be noted this is not the first time that Puerto Rico has defaulted, but it's a larger one, and the situation on the island continues to escalate. The patience of the creditors is wearing thin. It carries with it portents of defaults with even more devastating consequences.
And in talking about those consequences, the first thing you mentioned, and I appreciated that you started with this, is the human toll that has been already extracted from the people of Puerto Rico. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
That's right, Richard. So the upcoming payment that it will have to make to its creditors on July 1st, a $2 billion tranche, includes over $800 million in what's called general obligation bonds. And the reason I bring that up is because the very concept of general obligation bonds is at the heart of the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico, because the premise of those bonds is that they are constitutionally protected, meaning that the government can dishonor its obligations to its people. It can stop funding public services that it has already committed to in order to make those payments because they've been given this special constitutionally protected status. It's one of the many features and ways that Puerto Rico has helped enable its sort of debt binge over the years with the complicity of Congress and Wall Street, and perhaps at the behest of Congress and Wall Street.
Yeah, we're talking with Daniel Marans of the Huffington Post about Puerto Rico's financial situation, debt situation, and impending likely default. So the consequences of this include tens of thousands of layoffs of public employees, raising the sales tax from 7% to 11.5%. 10% of Puerto Rico's schools have been closed since 2014. I mean, I think it should be noted, and you do note, Daniel, that there was enormous corruption that was involved in driving up this debt. But the corruption did not involve the school children of Puerto Rico or the public employees of Puerto Rico or the people of Puerto Rico who are paying the sales tax. So you really have, the unemployment rate now 11.8%, more than double what it is in the mainland. So you really have people being punished who did not, in effect, commit the crime. And you mentioned the unique, these obligation bonds and so on. Puerto Rico's sort of odd political status, neither a state nor an independent country, really helped create this, right?
Absolutely. It's at the heart of just about all of the different questions here because Puerto Rico, it's not a state. It has a much lower income per capita. It arguably has a lesser infrastructure. But on the other hand, it is subject to the dollar. So that makes it more expensive to do business there than if it were a poorer country with its own currency. Its citizens its residents are U.S. citizens. They're free to leave at any time. And there are many different ways in which Congress has sort of kept its hand around Puerto Rico, so to speak. One of those ways is something called the Jones Act, which requires foreign flag ships going from one U.S. port to the next to to decamp effectively into a U.S. flagship. And many studies indicate that that has added a layer of middlemen to all the goods and services that then come to the island, since they usually come to the mainland United States first, and therefore making those goods and services more expensive on the island. It has led, another big thing, and I think this is really the most crucial thing to note, is that unlike the 50 states, Puerto Rico does not have the authority to extend federal bankruptcy protections to its municipalities and public corporations. And that means that, unlike the city of Detroit, which under Michigan state law can file for bankruptcy and say to its creditors, well, we're not going to keep starving our people in order to pay our bills. We simply cannot do it. It's a fundamental concept in Western law that dates back a long time. The concept of being able to seek court redress when you can no longer pay your debts and effectively have a judge force losses on the people to whom you owe money. But Puerto Rico does not enjoy that right, and it was barred from it, and it has tried to find all kinds of ways around it. But the creditors that are seeking that want their money back from Puerto Rico, many of which have bought its debt at a discounted rate from other distressed lenders, have enormous political influence, and they're doing their damnedest to try to prevent any action that would grant Puerto Rico even a sliver of those powers.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to you bring up a number of issues that I think are really important. One, the Jones Act does other things, but in the way it affects Puerto Rico, it seems to be a congressional giveaway to special interests at the expense of the Puerto Rican people. To the extent that Puerto Rico is neither fish nor fowl, it's not a state and it's not an independent country, so it's pegged to the dollar and suffers as a result of that. But it cannot declare bankruptcy, it can't float its currency the way an independent country could, but yet it's tied. It doesn't have the all the powers that a state enjoys, especially around bankruptcy, because that too was a congressional decision. I mean, number one is kind of globally, I can't be the first person who's found certain parallels between Puerto Rico's problems and those of Greece, for example, where you have some nominal political autonomy, but when it comes to economic matters, you're kind of hamstrung by forces who may not have your best interests at heart. I don't know. You think the Greece analogy works, or is it stretched too far?
I think that's a terrific analogy, Richard. Paul Krugman would disagree. He's made this whole show of saying, oh, this is completely different. Puerto Rico really needs to devalue its labor costs. He thinks that workers get paid too much in Puerto Rico. And I mean, I think perhaps in normal circumstances, one could debate those on the merits, but given that an effective pay cut to the already cash-strapped, impoverished, humanitarian crisis-ridden Puerto Rican population would only increase human suffering, I think it's something that is far less reasonable in these circumstances. It's so funny too, because last summer, along the lines of that parallel, the German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble, who very, very famously or infamously has been kind of the hardliner behind Angela Merkel in driving strong terms against Greece and claiming that he wouldn't mind seeing them booted from the Eurozone, sort of trolled the United States by saying that perhaps it has its own problems in the, quote, dollar zone with Puerto Rico, and that there was an analogy there, and that it should consider freeing Puerto Rico from the dollar zone, sort of saying, hey, United States, don't tell us to treat Greece better until you can figure out your Puerto Rico situation. And even a stop clock is right twice a day.
Right.
I think that there is some hypocrisy at play there.
And I just have to jump in and say that when your actions bring out the ironic humor of Wolfgang Schäuble, you might want to engage in a period of deep reflection. Just a thought I wanted to throw out there. So Daniel Marans of the Huffington Post. So we have this, to a certain extent, a parallel with Greece. We have this neither fish nor fowl status of Puerto Rico as a U.S. entity, and of course there are forces in Congress who don't want to see Puerto Rico become a state, which would resolve a lot of these issues. Because if Puerto Rico becomes a state, they would be very concerned that it would vote Democratic. So they don't want to add 2 Democratic senators and X number of Democratic representatives. I candidly, I think that's a big piece of it. Let's talk a little bit about the creditors, because you mentioned that they've bought up, many of them have bought up the debts to Puerto Rico of distressed other distressed lenders. To me, these are in many ways the most black and white villains of the piece. These are people who, in my opinion, but correct me if you feel differently and maybe fill in the outline, but I feel that these many of these creditors, what they do is they go in and they buy up the debts of a country or a local entity or state or territory like Puerto Rico and a government entity. And they then, if it's American based, they count on their political influence to ensure that they're able to do what perhaps other creditors were not able to do. In other words, they are investing in the misery of the people of Puerto Rico in order to make a buck, which makes them dreadful human beings. Am I unfair, on point?
I
You know,
Those are stark, almost biblical condemnations, Richard, and I know how much of a devout conventional theologian you are. No,
amen.
I think that you pretty much summed it up. We're talking about hedge funds that are nicknamed vultures, and I don't think that even they necessarily reject that term. It's believed that at this point, some 30% of the Puerto Rican government's $70 billion debt is held by these vulture hedge funds. And what these vulture hedge funds do is they buy debt at a discounted rate. They say to a mutual fund or a pension fund, look, Puerto Rico's not going to be able to pay this back, or they're not going to be able to pay it back at full value. We're going to buy it from you at a fraction of its cost, a fraction of what you bought it at, of the full dollar value that you purchased it at, and at least you'll get to keep some of that money. But that's what they then do is they specialize in being able to get paid back by Puerto Rico at the full dollar
Right.
value. And the reason they can often get terms like that is because a couple of years ago, at least, when these people were still even making deals with Puerto Rico, at this point, they're not even getting these new loans on the private market. The Puerto Rican government was so desperate, and so it really did appear as if the political leverage was in these people's hands to demand this kind of a full payback. And the real supreme, and right now Washington is being blanketed by an ad campaign from what appears to be some of these same people. It's all dark money. We don't really know for sure, but we're talking about big players like Paul Singer, the man who brought Argentina to its knees. We're talking about guys like John Paulson, who shorted the housing market and made billions that way. And and they're ads that are suspiciously from a group called the Center for Individual Freedom, for example. We don't know who's funding them, but they use stock photos of individuals that look sad to sort of put a Main Street face on who they think the bondholders are. And they claim that when Congress is discussing giving Puerto Rico some restructuring powers, that it is effectively bailing Puerto Rico out on the backs of retirees. And frankly, this strategy has appears to be working
Well,
because Paul Ryan was spearheading this. He saw the writing on the wall. Maybe he saw the politics of it with so many Puerto Ricans emigrating to the mainland as a result of this crisis and becoming a key voting bloc in Florida. But it's now stalled in a House subcommittee. I mean, that legislation, even unto itself, many Puerto Rican advocates will tell you, doesn't leave Puerto Rico with much. But it was probably going to be better than nothing, and now it's not even clear they can make that legislation happen until July 1st.
So these creditors are not backing down. The July 1st and won't unless God smites them, which is, my prayer. But and July 1st is approaching. So, in the minute or so we have left, any resolution where any idea where this thing is going to go?
I think there's a couple interesting things to watch. I have I don't have my best guess about Congress. I suspect there'll be something last minute, but there's a couple shoot the moon options. One of them is a local bankruptcy law that Puerto Rico has on the books that the Supreme Court is going to rule on in late June. And because Alito recused himself for the case, the liberals have an advantage. It looks like they may be sympathetic to Puerto Rico's argument. And then lastly, there is an entire question that's being raised and starting just a little bit to gain more traction, which is that much of Puerto Rico's debt may have been issued against Puerto Rico's constitution, in which case it may be able to be nullified. It's a radical idea, but it's something that a commission to audit Puerto Rico's debt, according to sources that I know who are close to it, has heard and was more receptive to than it was expected.
And who knows, maybe that can be used as leverage to at least negotiate the debt down. Who knows? But it's a very, very important story. It's a gripping human story with a lot of consequences for innocent people. And thank you for explaining it so well, Daniel Marans, political reporter for the Huffington Post. Thanks for coming on the program.
Always a pleasure, Richard.